Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most improbable rags to riches stories the world has ever told. The tale of a skinny, half-starved boy from the slums of London who somehow ended up the most famous face on the entire planet. Not the polished, top-hatted legend you have seen printed on posters and coffee mugs. I mean the real one. The child who slept in workhouses, whose father drank himself into an early grave, and whose mother slowly slipped away from him one heartbreaking afternoon at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a big sincere thank you to the kind soul who suggested this one in the comments. You lot really do shape everything that happens here, and every little idea you drop keeps this whole thing growing. By the way, the channel's now on Spotify too, so if you would rather drift off with just my voice and no screen glowing in your face, the link is waiting in the description. And if you'd like a little more, membership is already available on the channel, which gives you access to 8 hours of ad-free video to drift off to, uninterrupted, whenever you like. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and let your shoulders finally drop. Let us pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a boy who once queued for bread at a pauper school became richer than kings? Did the most beloved comedian in history really spend his childhood terrified of being sent back to the workhouse? Could you smile for the camera while your own mother was locked away in an asylum? Would you have the nerve to walk into a Hollywood studio with a borrowed accent and a suitcase full of nothing but ambition? And what does it actually feel like to be adored by millions one decade, then quietly told never to come back the next? Tonight we answer all of it. So let us rewind the reel, all the way back to a cold spring in 1889, to a cramped room in a grubby corner of South London, where a baby who would one day make the whole world laugh was born into a family that had very little to laugh about at all. London in 1889 was the beating heart of the largest empire the world had ever known, a city of gaslight, grandeur, and unimaginable wealth. But none of that glittering fortune ever made it as far as Walworth, the shabby South London district where Charles Spencer Chaplin came screaming into the world on the 16th of April. Here the streets smelled of coal smoke, boiled cabbage and horse manure, and the poverty was so thick you could practically wear it. It was a place where families packed into single rooms, where rent was always overdue, and where a bad month could send you tumbling into the workhouse without warning. Into this uncertain, hungry, overcrowded world arrived a delicate little boy with dark curls and enormous eyes, utterly unaware that he had just been born into the exact kind of misery he would one day turn into comic gold. To understand just how far Charlie would rise, you have to understand just how low the ground was beneath him. Victorian London was a city of astonishing contradictions, a place where a gentleman in a silk top hat might step out of a gleaming carriage, while 20 feet away a barefoot child begged for a crust of bread in the gutter. The empire stretched across a quarter of the globe, ruling millions, hoarding the wealth of continents, and yet somehow it could not manage to keep the children of its own capital fed. Walworth sat firmly on the wrong side of this arrangement. It was the kind of neighbourhood the wealthy hurried past with a handkerchief pressed to the nose, muttering about the smell. And the smell was real. Imagine the aroma of an unwashed stable, mixed with a fish market on a warm day, marinated in the fumes of 1,000 coal fires, and you were getting close. There was no plumbing to speak of, no refrigeration, and no escape from the sheer density of human life crammed into every square foot. People slept 4 and 5 to a bed, shared toilets with entire buildings, and considered a room with a window a genuine luxury. It made a modern studio apartment with a leaky tap and a noisy neighbour look like a 5-star resort with a spa package. The Chaplins were not the poorest of the poor, not quite. They hovered in that precarious zone just above total destitution, the zone where you might have a decent week followed by a catastrophic month, where survival depended entirely on luck, health, and staying just barely employed. It was financial life lived permanently on a tightrope, with no safety net, no savings account, and certainly no helpful government safety programs waiting to catch you. If you fell all the way down, and the bottom was very hard indeed. Into all of this arrived baby Charlie, blissfully ignorant of his circumstances as babies tend to be. He could not have known that his father was already a fragile presence, that his mother's health was a ticking clock, or that the family's brief brush with comfort was about to evaporate like a puddle in July. He simply did what all newborns do. He cried, he ate, and he demanded attention, and in that respect at least he was perfectly suited to his future profession. It is one of history's great jokes that some of the funniest people who ever lived were forged in the least funny circumstances imaginable. And nobody proves this better than the wailing infant of Woolworth, who would spend a lifetime turning hunger, loss and despair into laughter for millions. But before he could make the world laugh, he first had to learn where laughter came from, and in his family it came from the stage. Charlie did not come from money, but he did come from magic, or at least the cheap grease paint version of it sold nightly on the music hall stage. Both of his parents were entertainers, performers who sang and danced for coins in the smoky variety theatres that were the Victorian equivalent of streaming television. His mother, Hannah, performed under the stage name Lily Harley, a slight, pretty woman with a sweet singing voice and a gift for mimicry that little Charlie would inherit in full. His father, also called Charles, was a baritone with real talent and a real problem. For a brief moment early on, the family had a taste of comfort, of applause and steady bookings, but show business is a fickle master, and the golden glow around the Chaplin household was already beginning to flicker and fade. The music hall was the great entertainment engine of Victorian Britain, a rowdy, boozy, gloriously unpretentious world that had almost nothing to do with the polished theatres of the wealthy. Picture a large hall packed shoulder to shoulder with working people, thick with pipe smoke and the smell of spilled beer, everyone shouting, laughing and heckling the performers on stage. There were singers, comics, jugglers, acrobats, magicians and animal acts, all competing for the fickle affection of a crowd that had paid good money and expected to be entertained. It was loud, chaotic and completely alive, and if you could win over a music hall audience, you could win over anyone. Hannah, as Lily Harley, made her modest living in exactly this arena. She was never a major star, but she had charm, a light singing voice, and above all an extraordinary talent for observation. She could watch a stranger walk down the street and then, minutes later, reproduce their walk, their posture, and their little unconscious mannerisms so perfectly that Charlie would howl with laughter. In their cramped room, she would sit by the window and narrate the passing crowd, becoming each person in turn, and this became young Charlie's first and finest education in the art of comedy. Forget drama school. He had a mother who was a one-woman character study performing for free. His father was a different story. Charles Sr. possessed a genuinely fine baritone voice, and, for a while, real success. He appeared on bills across London, and even had his image printed on sheet music, which in that era was roughly the equivalent of going viral. Money came in. There were better rooms, better clothes, and the tantalizing sensation of a family on the way up. For a fleeting moment, the Chaplins tasted the kind of security they had never known, and it must have felt like the world was finally tilting in their favour. But the entertainment industry then, as now, was ruthless in its indifference. Bookings dried up as quickly as they appeared. Tastes changed, rivals emerged, and a performer who was the toast of the town one season could find themselves forgotten and unemployed the next. There were no royalties trickling in, no comfortable pensions, no residual checks arriving in the post. You were only ever as good as your last performance, and the moment you stopped drawing a crowd, the crowd stopped drawing you a living. So the brief golden glow began to fade, dimming season by season like a lamp running low on oil. What the Chaplin family did not yet fully grasp was that the greatest threat to their fragile comfort was not the fickleness of the audience at all. It was sitting right there at their own table, in the form of Charlie's father and the bottle he could never quite put down. If you are searching this story for a warm, doting father figure, prepare for disappointment, because Charlie's dad was mostly a rumour. Charles Chaplin Sr. had genuine ability as a singer, but he had an even more genuine talent for drinking, and the two did not coexist peacefully. He drifted away from the family while Charlie was still tiny, leaving Hannah to raise two boys largely alone. The occasional court order squeezed a few shillings out of him, but the money came about as reliably as English sunshine. His absence hung over the household like a damp fog, and his eventual fate would serve as a grim warning that Charlie never quite forgot. It is a strange irony that the man who could not hold his own life together helped produce a son who would hold the whole world's attention. Alcohol and the music hall went together like fish and chips, which was a large part of the problem. Performers were often paid, quite literally, in the pubs and taverns attached to the theatres, and a successful act was expected to drink with admirers, drink with promoters, and drink to celebrate a good night. It was an occupational hazard baked directly into the job, a workplace where the break room was a bar and everyone bought you rounds. For a man with a weakness for the bottle, it was less a career than a slow-moving trap, and Charles Sr. walked straight into it. As the drinking deepened, his talent curdled and his reliability collapsed. Bookings slipped away, his voice suffered, and the money that had once flowed into the household slowed to a trickle, and then stopped almost entirely. He and Hannah separated, and he simply removed himself from his son's daily lives, becoming a distant figure they saw only occasionally, if at all. For a small boy, having a father who is technically alive but functionally absent is a peculiar kind of ache, the presence of an absence, a hole shaped exactly like a person who was supposed to be there. The law, in theory, required him to contribute to the support of his children. In practice, extracting those payments was like trying to squeeze water from a stone, if the stone were also frequently drunk and difficult to locate. Hannah would occasionally have to pursue him through the courts for a handful of shillings, a humiliating and exhausting process that rarely produced much. Imagine having to file paperwork and beg a magistrate just to get your co-parent to chip in for bread, and you begin to understand the daily grind of her existence. There was one strange, brief interlude when Charlie and his brother were sent to live with their father and his new partner for a spell. When Hannah's own troubles left her unable to care for them, it was not a happy arrangement. The household was chaotic and steeped in drink, and the boys were often neglected, sometimes locked out or left to fend for themselves. It was less a rescue than a lateral move into a different flavour of hardship, swapping one struggling home for another. In the end, the bottle claimed him entirely. Charles Chaplin Sr. drank himself into an early grave, while still a fairly young man, his gifts squandered, and his family left to survive without him. For Charlie, It was a lesson delivered in the harshest possible terms about where a lack of discipline could lead. Throughout his own extraordinary life, he would guard his money, his career, and his self-control with an almost fierce intensity, as if forever running from the fate that had swallowed his father whole. But that lay far ahead, for now a tiny Charlie was about to have his very first, entirely accidental taste of the stage. Every legend needs an origin story, and Charlie's arrived when he was barely tall enough to see over the footlights. He was round 5 years old, watching from the wings as his mother performed, when her voice suddenly cracked and gave out mid-song, dissolving into a thin, humiliating croak. The crowd began to jeer, the way music hall crowds always did. And then, in a moment that sounds too perfect to be real but genuinely happened, little Charlie was pushed out onto the stage to fill the silence. He sang. He mimicked. He picked up the coins the delighted audience tossed at his feet and made a joke of it, and the theatre roared with laughter and applause. His mother's career was quietly ending. His had just accidentally begun. To appreciate the sheer terror of the moment, you have to understand what a music hall audience was actually like. This was not a hushed, respectful crowd sitting politely in the dark. This was a heaving, half-drunk mob who had paid for a good time and would let you know, immediately and loudly, if they were not getting one. A performer whose voice failed did not receive gentle sympathy and a get-well card. They received boos, jeers, catcalls, and quite possibly a vegetable or two hurled from the cheap seats. It was the original hostile comment section, except the trolls were right there in the room and armed with produce. So when Hannah's voice broke apart on stage, it was not merely embarrassing, it was a small public catastrophe, the visible collapse of the one thing keeping food on the family table. Her throat had been weakened by illness and strain, and on this particular night it simply refused to cooperate, leaving her stranded in front of a crowd rapidly turning nasty. It was every performer's worst nightmare made real, unfolding in front of the very people who decided whether she ate that week. What happened next was pure instinct, the desperate improvisation of a stage manager with a sinking act and a charming child conveniently on hand. Little Charlie, who'd been watching from the wings and who already knew his mother's songs and mannerisms by heart, was nudged out into the blinding lights to buy time. Most 5-year-olds, faced with a jeering crowd of adults, would freeze, burst into tears, and flee. Charlie did the opposite. He launched into a popular song of the day, imitating the performers he had studied endlessly, and the crowd, charmed by the tiny confident boy, fell silent and then delighted. Then came the moment that reveals the whole of his genius in miniature. As he sang, the tickled audience began tossing coins onto the stage, a music hall sign of genuine approval, and Charlie, all of 5 years old, stopped singing to announce that he would go and pick up the money first and finish the song afterward. The crowd erupted. This unplanned little joke, this cheeky child interrupting his own act to prioritise the cash, brought the house down harder than any song could have. Even at 5, he understood something profound about comedy, that the honest, human, slightly greedy impulse is funnier than any polished routine. He scampered about the stage collecting the coins, improvised more songs and impressions, and had the room eating out of his tiny hand. It was by every account a triumph. It was also the last time his mother would ever perform on a stage. Her voice never fully recovered, and with it went the family's primary source of income. There is a heartbreaking symmetry to it, a torch passing from one generation to the next in a single evening. As Hannah stepped out of the spotlight for good, her little boy stepped into it, and neither of them yet understood that this was the moment everything changed. Nor did they realize that far darker days were coming, and coming fast. Hannah Chaplin was the sun that Charlie's entire small world revolved around, which made it all the more devastating when that sun began to dim. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of poverty slowly eroded her mind, and she began to suffer episodes that frightened the two boys who loved her more than anything. She would drift into confusion, hearing and seeing things that were not there, and eventually she was taken away to be treated in an asylum, leaving her sons alone and adrift. For Charlie, watching his mother unravel was a wound that never fully healed. It was a helplessness he could do nothing about, a heartbreak that would echo quietly beneath even his funniest films for the rest of his life. With her performing days over and her husband gone, Hannah tried desperately to keep the family afloat. She took in sewing, working long hours hunched over a needle for pitiful pay, her eyes straining in the dim light of their tiny room. She pawned their few possessions piece by piece, a slow-motion liquidation of everything they owned, until there was almost nothing left to sell. It was the kind of grinding, relentless poverty that wears a person down not in one dramatic blow, but in 1,000 small daily defeats, and Hannah absorbed every one of them while trying to shield her boys from the worst. But the human mind and body can only take so much. Chronic hunger, ceaseless stress, and quite possibly an untreated illness combined to push her past her limits. Modern doctors looking back suspect that severe malnutrition and infection may have played a direct role in her mental decline, that her mind was quite literally starving along with the rest of her. In an era with no real understanding of these connections and no meaningful support for the desperate poor, there was no one to catch her as she fell. The episodes came gradually and then more often. She would become disoriented, speak of things that made no sense, and lose her grip on the reality her sons could see. For two young boys, there are few experiences more frightening than watching a beloved parent transform into someone they no longer recognize, the one solid anchor in their chaotic lives suddenly coming loose. Charlie, still just a child, found himself in the impossible position of caring for the very person who was supposed to care for him, a role reversal no small boy should ever have to shoulder. Eventually she was committed to an asylum, the institutions of the day being blunt and often cruel instruments that offered containment rather than genuine treatment. She would be released and readmitted more than once over the years, a heartbreaking cycle of brief recoveries and painful relapses. Each separation tore at Charlie, and each fragile reunion carried the shadow of the next inevitable parting. He loved her with an intensity that never faded, and even at the height of his wealth and fame decades later, he would take pains to see that she was cared for in comfort, finally able to give her the security she had never been able to give herself. But that was the future. In the present, a small boy and his brother were left essentially alone in one of the harshest cities on earth, with a mother locked away and a father in the bottom of a bottle. There is a particular loneliness to being a child without functioning parents, a sense of standing at the edge of a vast cold world with no one to hold your hand. Charlie was about to learn just how cold that world could be, because with no one left to care for them, the state had a solution for boys like him, and its name was enough to make any Victorian child tremble. For a poor family in Victorian England, there was one word that inspired more terror than any ghost story, and that word was workhouse. These grim, prison-like institutions were where the destitute went when they had absolutely nowhere else to turn, and they were designed to be miserable enough to discourage anyone from relying on them. With his mother institutionalized and his father useless, Charlie found himself passing through the gates of the Lambeth Workhouse, a child processed like a case file rather than a boy. Families were separated on arrival, food was thin and joyless, and the whole place ran on cold routine and quiet shame. It was the lowest rung of the entire social ladder, and Charlie was standing on it before he'd even lost all his baby teeth. The philosophy behind the workhouse was frankly monstrous by any modern standard. The authorities of the day genuinely believed that poverty was largely a moral failing, a sign of laziness or bad character, and that any help offered to the poor must be made so thoroughly unpleasant that only the truly desperate would ever accept it. This charming principle meant that conditions were kept deliberately harsh, deliberately humiliating, and deliberately joyless. It was a support system designed, from the ground up, to punish the very people it was supposedly helping. Think of it as customer service engineered specifically to make you never, ever want to use the service again. Upon arrival, families were broken apart with brisk efficiency. Men went one way, women another, and children a third, all housed separately with little opportunity to see one another. For Charlie, this meant being torn from his brother and the last shreds of familiar comfort, absorbed into a mass of anonymous, identically dressed children. The clothes themselves were a coarse, scratchy uniform that stripped away any sense of individuality, turning each child into an interchangeable unit of the poor. You did not arrive at the workhouse as a person. You arrived as a problem to be managed. The food was a masterpiece of joylessness, engineered to sustain life at the absolute minimum without ever offering the sin of enjoyment. Thin gruel, watery soup, and hard bread formed the backbone of the diet, served in monotonous rotation and rarely in generous portions. A growing boy was perpetually, gnawingly hungry, his stomach a constant quiet complaint. It made the blandest cafeteria mystery meal you have ever pushed around a tray look like a banquet fit for a king. The days were governed by rigid, unforgiving routine. Bells rang, lines formed, and every hour was accounted for with a discipline that left no room for play, curiosity, or childhood itself. Silence was often enforced, laughter discouraged, and the entire atmosphere pressed down on the residents like a heavy, colourless blanket. For a boy whose mind was already fizzing with imagination and mischief, this deadening regularity must have been its own special kind of torture, a slow smothering of the spirit. And hanging over everything was the shame. To be a workhouse child was to wear a visible mark of the lowest possible status, to be pitied at best and despised at worst by the world outside its walls. Charlie was old enough to feel the sting of it keenly, to understand exactly how far his family had fallen. It planted in him a deep, lifelong horror of poverty and a fierce determination to escape it that would drive him for the rest of his days. But escape was not yet on the menu. First, the state had one more grim institution in store for him, and it would take him even further from everything he knew. From the workhouse, Charlie was shipped off to a school for orphaned and destitute children, a bleak institution far from the only home he'd ever known. Here the days were regimented, the discipline was harsh, and homesickness sat in his stomach like a stone that never dissolved. Worst of all, he was often separated from Sydney, his older half-brother and fiercest protector, the one person who made the whole ordeal survivable. Sydney was Charlie's anchor, his defender, and later his shrewd business partner, and being apart from him made an already lonely childhood almost unbearable. These were the years that taught Charlie what it truly meant to have nothing and no one, lessons he would later pour, drop by drop, into the sad and smiling eyes of a certain little tramp. The school, run as a kind of institutional home for pauper children, was located well outside London, which meant Charlie was not merely poor and parentless, but also physically removed from the streets and rhythms he understood. For a child, geography matters enormously. Being sent away is a particular flavour of abandonment, a sense of being posted like an unwanted parcel to somewhere distant and strange. The familiar chaos of Walworth, grim as it was, had at least been his. This new place was foreign, cold, and governed by strangers who saw him as one small mouth among hundreds. Discipline at such institutions was administered with the enthusiasm of the age, which is to say liberally and often with a cane. Corporal punishment was considered not cruelty but character building, the standard tool for keeping large numbers of children in line. Charlie experienced his share of it, including at least one memorable public caning that left a lasting impression, as public canings tend to do. In an era that treated children's discomfort as morally instructive, comfort was simply not on offer. You learned to keep your head down, follow the rules, and dream of somewhere else. The routine was relentless. Rise at a set hour, wash in cold water, line up, eat the meagre rations, attend lessons, perform chores, and repeat day after identical day. There was schooling of a sort, a basic education hammered into the children alongside practical trades, meant to prepare them for lives of manual labour. It was not designed to nurture genius. It was designed to produce compliant, employable poor people, and it had all the warmth and imagination of a factory conveyor belt. Through all of this, the ache of homesickness never truly left him. It was not homesickness for a comfortable house, because he had never had one, but for his mother, for his brother, for the intangible feeling of belonging to someone. That longing settled into him and never fully departed, becoming part of the emotional bedrock from which he would later build his art. The little tramp's ability to convey profound loneliness with a single wistful glance did not come from nowhere. It came from a small boy lying awake in an institutional dormitory, missing everyone he loved. Sydney was the great exception, the one warm point in the cold. Older, tougher, and endlessly loyal, he was Charlie's protector whenever they were together, and his most painful absence whenever they were apart. Sydney would later join the Navy for a time, then return to become instrumental in managing Charlie's career, negotiating his contracts, and guarding his interest with the fierce devotion of a big brother who'd never stopped looking out for his little one. Their bond, forged in shared hardship, would prove one of the most important relationships of Charlie's entire life. But brothers cannot always be together, and the state cannot house you forever. Sooner or later, a boy in Charlie's position had to face the fundamental question of survival on his own terms. How exactly does a child with no money, no parents, and no prospects manage to keep himself fed? Charlie was about to find out, one odd job at a time. While most children today are worrying about homework and screen time, Charlie was worrying about where his next meal was coming from. Long before he was a teenager, he was hustling for money in every honest and semi-honest way a small boy could manage. He ran errands, swept up in a barber shop, worked as a newspaper seller, a printer's helper, a glassblower's assistant, and just about anything else that paid a few coins. None of it lasted, and none of it paid much, but all of it taught him a relentless streetwise resourcefulness. He learned to read a room, to charm a stranger, and to survive on wit and grit alone. It was an education you could not buy, and it would prove far more valuable than anything a proper school could ever have offered him. Child labour in Victorian Britain was not a scandal. It was simply how things worked. Poor children were expected to contribute to their own survival as soon as they were physically able, and the notion of a protected, carefree childhood was a luxury reserved almost entirely for the wealthy. So Charlie, small and slight and perpetually hungry, threw himself into the great chaotic marketplace of odd jobs that a resourceful youngster could scrounge in a big city. It was the original gig economy, except with no app, no reviews, and considerably more risk of losing a finger. The variety of his early employment reads like a list generated by a very desperate careers advisor. He swept hair in a barber shop, inhaling the clippings of half of South London. He hawked newspapers on the street, competing with other boys for the best corners and the most generous customers. He assisted a printer, lugging heavy materials and choking on ink fumes. He tried his hand at glass blowing, a trade involving furnaces hot enough to make a summer heat wave feel like a gentle breeze, which is a genuinely alarming workplace for a child. Each job came and each job went, usually because he was too young, too small, or the work simply dried up. What none of these jobs offered was stability, or fair pay, or anything resembling a future. What they offered instead was something Charlie would come to value even more, which was a graduate-level education in human nature. Selling newspapers, you learn very quickly which passers-by will buy and which will brush you off, how to catch an eye, how to make a sale in 3 seconds flat. Working in a barber shop, you observe every kind of customer, the vain and the cheap and the chatty and the sour, an endless parade of characters to be filed away for later use. Charlie was, without realizing it, assembling an enormous mental library of human behavior. He also developed a survivor's instinct, a sharp awareness of his surroundings, and an ability to adapt on the fly. When you never know where your next meal is coming from, you become extraordinarily attuned to opportunity and danger alike. You learn to charm the person who might feed you and to sidestep the person who might rob you. You learn that a smile and a bit of cheek can open doors that force never will. These were survival skills, but they were also, in a very real sense, performance skills, and Charlie was mastering both at once. Through it all ran a single unbreakable thread, the burning determination to get out. Charlie did not accept his poverty as his destiny. He watched the performers, remembered the roar of the crowd on that long-ago night his mother's voice failed, and he wanted that world with a hunger that outmatched even his hunger for food. He knew, with a child's stubborn certainty, that the stage was his way up and out. All he needed was a foot in the door, and that foot, as it happened, would arrive strapped into a pair of wooden clogs. Charlie's first real break came in the unlikely form of clogs. He joined a troupe of child performers called the 8 Lancashire Lads, a clog dancing act that toured the music halls of Britain, clattering out rhythms in wooden shoes. For a boy who had known nothing but instability, life on the road with the troupe offered structure, regular meals, and best of all, the intoxicating thrill of a live audience. He was not yet the star of the show, just one small dancer in a row of them, but he was learning. He was studying timing, watching how the crowd responded, absorbing the craft of holding a room. The applause was addictive, and Charlie, hungry in every possible sense, drank it in. Clog dancing was a genuinely popular form of entertainment in that era, a percussive, foot-stamping spectacle in which performers in heavy wooden-soled shoes hammered out intricate rhythms on the stage. Done well, it was mesmerizing, a kind of human drum machine before drum machines existed, all synchronized clatter and disciplined energy. A troupe of children performing it in unison was exactly the sort of wholesome, high-energy novelty act that music hall audiences adored, and the 8 Lancashire Lads made a decent little living touring it around the country. For Charlie, Joining the troupe was nothing short of transformative. Consider what it offered a boy in his position. There was regular work, which meant regular food, an almost unimaginable luxury after the thin gruel of the workhouse. There was a place to sleep, structure to his days, and the companionship of other children doing the same thing. After years of instability and abandonment, this modest, rickety travelling routine must have felt astonishingly secure. He had gone from surviving on scraps and odd jobs to being, in a small way, a professional. He had a purpose, but the true prize was the audience. Standing on a stage, feeling the eyes of a room upon him, hearing the applause wash over the troupe at the end of a number, Charlie experienced something he would chase for the rest of his life. There is particular electricity to live performance, a direct current running between performer and crowd, and for a boy starved of love and attention and security, that current was pure oxygen. Every clap was a small reassurance that he mattered, that he existed, that he was good at something. It is not hard to see how a lonely child might become permanently hooked on that feeling. He was, admittedly, a very small cog in the machine, one of 8 nearly identical boys in a chorus line, not a star and not a soloist. But Charlie was never merely performing. He was studying. Even as he clattered through the routines, part of his mind was always watching the crowd, noting what made them laugh, what bored them, when their attention wandered and when it snapped back. He was absorbing the invisible mechanics of entertainment, the rhythm of a good act, the way a room could be won or lost. This was market research conducted from inside the product, and Charlie was an exceptionally attentive researcher. He also began to suspect, quietly, that dancing was not really his calling. The clogs were fine, the structure was welcome, but his instincts kept pulling him toward something more, toward comedy, toward character, toward making people laugh rather than simply tapping his feet in time. He watched the comics on the same bills with special hunger, sensing that his true talent lay in that direction. The Lancashire lads had given him a foothold, a taste of the professional stage and a full belly. Now he wanted more. He wanted to act, to perform, to command a stage as a person rather than a pair of dancing feet, and he was about to take his first real steps toward exactly that. Clog dancing was fun, but Charlie's real ambitions lay in acting, and he chased them with a determination that bordered on obsession. Still just a boy, he began landing small roles in stage plays, most notably as a cheeky page boy in a touring production of a Sherlock Holmes drama, a part he played on and off for years. On stage he discovered he had a natural instinct for comedy and for winning an audience's affection, an instinct that could not be taught. He was still poor, still uncertain of where he would sleep some nights, but for the first time he could see a possible future stretching out ahead of him. Acting was not just a job. It was a lifeline, a way out of the gutter, and he gripped it with both hands. Breaking into acting, even at the humble level available to a poor teenage boy, required a kind of relentless persistence that would have defeated most people. There were no talent agents scouting street corners, no easy auditions, no shortcuts for a child with no connections and no money for training. Charlie simply presented himself again and again, chased down leads, and made himself impossible to overlook. He had the enormous advantage of already being a seasoned performer, comfortable on a stage in a way that many older, better educated hopefuls were not. Years of clattering clogs and hustling for coins had given him a poise that could not be faked. The role of the page boy in the Sherlock Holmes production became something of a steady anchor for him. It was not a large part, but it was a good one, a plucky, sharp-tongued servant with just enough personality to let a clever young actor shine. Charlie played it in various touring companies over an extended stretch, refining his delivery, sharpening his timing, and gradually building both his skill and his modest reputation. Touring life remained hard, all cheap lodgings and endless train journeys and uncertain wages, but it was the life he wanted, and that made all the difference. It was during these years that Charlie truly discovered the shape of his own gift. He found that he could make an audience laugh not merely by falling over or pulling faces, but through something subtler, a look, a pause, a perfectly judged reaction. He learned that he could make a crowd like him, could win their affection, and pull them onto his side within moments of stepping into the light. This is a rare and precious quality, the sort of thing that separates the merely competent performer from the genuinely magnetic one, and it cannot be manufactured in any drama school. Either you have it, or you do not, and Charlie, it turned out, had it in abundance. His confidence grew with each performance. The frightened, homesick workhouse child was slowly being replaced by a young man who knew, with quiet certainty, that he was good at this, perhaps very good. That self-belief would later curdle into a reputation for being difficult and demanding, but its roots were entirely healthy. It was the well-earned assurance of someone who had tested his talent against real audiences, night after night, and watched it work. When you have made a room full of strangers laugh with nothing but your own body and instincts, you tend to stop doubting yourself. Life, of course, was still precarious. The pay was modest, the future uncertain, and there were surely nights when Charlie wondered where exactly he would lay his head. But for the first time the uncertainty was pointed in a hopeful direction. He was no longer merely surviving. He was building something, brick by careful brick, moving with purpose toward a goal he could finally see. He had a craft, a growing reputation, and an unshakable ambition, and all he needed now was a bigger stage on which to prove himself. That stage, run by the undisputed king of British comedy, was about to open its doors, and stepping through them would change the course of his life forever. Every great comedian needs a training ground, and for Charlie that training ground was the legendary company of Fred Karno, the reigning king of British physical comedy. Karno ran a sprawling troupe of comic performers who specialised in wordless slapstick sketches, elaborate pantomimes of chaos, pratfalls, and precisely timed nonsense. Getting hired was a serious achievement for a young unknown, and Charlie earned his place through sheer talent and cheek. Under Karno's roof he learned the mechanics of comedy, the way an apprentice learns a trade, studying how a stumble could be milked for laughs, and how silence could be funnier than any punchline. This was his university, his conservatory, and his boot camp all rolled into one, and he was about to graduate straight into history. Fred Karno was a genuine phenomenon of the British entertainment world, a former acrobat turned impresario who had built an empire out of making people fall over funny. His genius lay in understanding that comedy could be a precision craft, that a well-constructed slapstick sketch was as carefully engineered as a fine watch, every gag timed to the split second, every collision choreographed like a dance. He drilled his performers mercilessly until their routines ran with clockwork accuracy, and the results were sketches so beloved they toured for years. Landing a spot in a Karno company was, for a young comic, roughly the equivalent of a struggling musician being invited to join the most respected band in the country. Charlie had watched, waited, and pestered his way toward this opportunity, aided considerably by his brother Sidney, who had joined Karno first and helped open the door. When Charlie finally got his chance to audition, he seized it with both hands, though not without the usual first-day nerves that plague anyone starting an intimidating new job. Karno was reportedly unimpressed at first glance by the pale, quiet young man, but the moment Charlie began to perform, all doubt evaporated. On stage, the shy boy transformed utterly, and his talent was so undeniable that a place in the company was quickly secured. What followed was the most important artistic education of his life. Karno's sketches were built almost entirely on physical comedy and pantomime, telling their stories through movement, expression, and impeccable timing rather than dialogue. This suited Charlie perfectly, because he had an extraordinary gift for expressing complex emotion and intention with his body alone. He learned how to make an audience anticipate a fall and then subvert their expectations, how to build a gag layer by layer until it detonated in laughter, and how a single held pause could wring more comedy out of a moment than a dozen frantic movements. It was the grammar of visual comedy, and he was becoming fluent. He also learned the value of pathos, the delicate art of mixing sadness with the silliness. The best Karno routines were not merely funny, they had a beating heart, a little thread of humanity that made the audience care about the poor fool stumbling through the chaos. Charlie absorbed this lesson deeply, and it would become the defining feature of his own work, the quality that separated him from every mere clown who could only make people laugh. He understood that you laugh hardest at the underdog you also happen to love. By his own later admission, everything he became as a filmmaker was rooted in what he learned during these years. The timing, the character work, the marriage of comedy and emotion, all of it was forged in the demanding, disciplined kingdom of Fred Karno. He was no longer a raw talent hustling for scraps. He was a trained professional comic with a formidable set of skills and a growing hunger to use them. And within the company, one particular role was about to make him a standout, a performance so brilliant that it would carry him across an ocean. Within the Karno company, Charlie developed the comic skills that would define his entire career, and one sketch in particular made him a standout. He became famous within the troupe for playing a hopeless, staggering drunk, a routine that required extraordinary balance, control, and split-second timing to make falling over look effortless and hilarious. It sounds simple, but performing convincing physical comedy is brutally hard work, closer to ballet than buffoonery. Audiences howled, and fellow performers took note that the skinny lad from South London had something rare. He was not just funny, he was precise, graceful, and utterly committed to the bit. All that mattered now was that the right person, in the right place, at the right time, would happen to be watching. The drunk character appeared most memorably in a Karno sketch set in a music hall, in which Charlie played an inebriated swell in the audience who repeatedly and disastrously interrupts the show. It was a role that let him unleash the full range of his physical gifts, teetering, swaying, collapsing, and recovering in a continuous cascade of near disasters that never quite became actual disasters. The comedy lay entirely in the control beneath the apparent chaos, the way he could appear to be moments from crashing to the floor while remaining in perfect command of every muscle. It was drunkenness performed with the discipline of an athlete. Here is the thing that audiences never fully appreciate about great physical comedy. Making your body look clumsy, uncoordinated, and out of control demands the exact opposite of clumsiness. To fall convincingly without hurting yourself, to stagger in a way that reads as hilarious rather than merely alarming, to time a stumble so it lands precisely on a beat, all of this requires the coordination of a gymnast and the timing of a musician. It is genuinely closer to dance than to accident. Charlie made it look like anyone could do it, which is precisely why it was so brilliant, and precisely why almost no one else could. His total commitment to the character was another quality that set him apart. Charlie did not simply perform a drunk, he became one, sinking so fully into the role that every gesture, every glazed expression, every wobble felt observed from real life rather than invented for the stage. And of course, it was observed from real life. He had grown up surrounded by drink and its effects, had watched his own father dissolve into it, and now, in a bitter and brilliant transformation, he mined that painful familiarity for comedy gold. There is something almost defiant about a boy taking the very force that destroyed his father and turning it into the routine that made his name. The sketch became one of the company's most reliable crowd pleasers, and Charlie's reputation grew accordingly. Fellow performers, a notoriously hard-to-impress bunch, recognized that they were sharing the stage with someone unusually gifted. Word spread within the tight-knit world of professional comedy that the young Chaplin was one to watch, a performer with a rare and complete command of his craft. He had risen from being a nervous new hire to being one of Karno's most valued players, an ascent driven entirely by talent and relentless dedication. All that remained now was luck, that final ingredient no amount of skill can conjure on its own. Charlie had built himself into an exceptional performer, but the world was full of exceptional performers labouring in obscurity. What he needed was to be in the right place at the right moment, in front of exactly the right pair of eyes, and as it happened, the entire Karno company was about to embark on a journey that would carry Charlie thousands of miles from the London slums, across a vast ocean, toward a country and an industry that would recognise his gift and make him immortal. In 1910, Charlie boarded a ship bound for America as part of Karno's touring company, crossing an ocean toward a country he had only imagined. For a boy who had grown up believing the world ended at the edge of a London slum, the sheer scale of America was overwhelming. The towns were bigger, the audiences were louder, and the sense of possibility hung in the air like electricity. He toured the vaudeville circuit, performing his sketches night after night, slowly building a reputation among the people who mattered. He did not know it yet, but this was the country that would make him a god, and then, decades later, break his heart. For now, though, he was simply a hungry young performer, watching a new world unspool before his eyes. The ocean crossing itself was an adventure of the kind Charlie could scarcely have imagined a few years earlier. To go from scavenging for coins in Walworth to boarding a transatlantic steamer bound for America was a leap so vast it must have felt like stepping into a storybook. The voyage took the better part of 2 weeks, a slow rolling passage across grey and endless water, and for a young man who had never left his own country, every mile carried him further into the unknown. Whatever seasickness and cramped conditions he endured, the sheer romance of the journey surely outweighed them. When he arrived, America hit him like a wave. Everything was bigger, brasher, and more energetic than the tired old world he had left behind. The cities pulsed with a restless ambition. The streets teemed with immigrants from every corner of the earth chasing their own versions of a dream, and the whole country seemed to vibrate with a conviction that anything was possible for anyone willing to work for it. For a boy who had been taught by circumstance that his place in the world was fixed and low, this intoxicating spirit of possibility was a revelation. In Britain, class was destiny. In America, or so it seemed, destiny was up for grabs. The touring itself was grueling, a relentless grind of vaudeville houses across the sprawling continent. Vaudeville was the American cousin of the British music hall, a variety format packed with singers, comics, acrobats, and novelty acts, and the Karno company slotted into it beautifully. Charlie performed his sketches town after town, city after city, night after night, honing his craft in front of American audiences who laughed at his physical comedy just as heartily as British ones had. Comedy, he was learning, was a language that needed no translation, and his fluency in it crossed borders effortlessly. Life on the road remained far from glamorous. It meant endless train journeys, indifferent lodgings, and the perpetual low-grade exhaustion of the travelling performer. But Charlie was accustomed to hardship, and this was hardship in pursuit of a dream rather than mere survival, which made all the difference in the world. He saved his money carefully, ever mindful of his father's fate, and he watched and absorbed everything, filing away impressions of this vast new country the way he had once filed away the mannerisms of strangers passing his mother's window. Most importantly, he was getting noticed. Within the tight professional world of American entertainment, people were beginning to talk about the extraordinarily gifted young Englishman in the Karno troupe, the one who could make a room roar with nothing but his body and his timing. Reputations in that world travelled by word of mouth, and Charlie's was quietly spreading toward the very people who were about to reshape entertainment forever. Because just as Charlie was making his mark on the American stage, a strange, flickering new medium was exploding into existence, one that was desperate for exactly the kind of talent he possessed. The movies were calling, though Charlie did not yet know it. By the time Charlie returned to America for a second tour, the entertainment world was being turned upside down by a strange new invention: the moving picture. Silent film was exploding in popularity, and the fledgling studios were desperate for performers who could make people laugh without speaking a single word, which happened to be Charlie's exact specialty. During his performances, he caught the attention of people from the film business who saw something in this expressive, rubber-limbed young Englishman. An offer was made. It meant leaving the stage he had worked so hard to conquer for the uncertain, undignified, sneered-at world of the movies. It was a gamble. But Charlie Chaplin had been gambling with his own survival since he was 5 years old, and he was very good at it. The moving picture in those early years was a genuine marvel, a technology so new that people still gathered in astonishment to watch flickering images dance across a screen. Short comedic films in particular were finding enormous popularity, screened in modest storefront theatres where working people could pay a few pennies to escape their lives for a while. It was cheap, accessible entertainment for the masses, and demand was insatiable. The studios churning out these films needed a constant supply of performers, and above all they needed performers who could be funny without sound, since sound was not yet part of the equation. This last point cannot be overstated, because it was the exact hinge on which Charlie's entire future would turn. Silent film could not use dialogue, which meant that everything, absolutely everything, had to be conveyed through movement, expression, and gesture. A performer who relied on witty spoken lines was useless in this medium, but a performer who could tell an entire story with a raised eyebrow, a shrug, or a perfectly timed fall was pure gold. Charlie, trained in the wordless pantomime tradition of Fred Karno, was almost supernaturally suited to it. It was as if he had spent his whole life unknowingly preparing for a medium that had only just been invented. The people who ran these early studios were always on the hunt for fresh talent, and they had scouts and associates watching the vaudeville circuits for performers who might translate well to film, Charlie's sketches, and especially his brilliant drunk routine, drew exactly the kind of attention that mattered. Here was a young man whose comedy was entirely physical, entirely visual, and entirely captivating. To a film producer, he must have looked less like a stage comic and more like a solution to a problem, a ready-made silent film star hiding in plain sight in a touring British troupe. An offer duly arrived, and with it came a genuine dilemma. Charlie had worked ferociously hard to reach his respected position on the stage, and the stage was where entertainers of standing performed. Film, by contrast, was widely looked down upon by serious theatrical people as a cheap, vulgar novelty, a lesser art suited to lesser talents. To leave the legitimate stage for the flickering screen was, in the eyes of many, a step down rather than up. There was real risk that the whole thing was a passing fad, that he might abandon a solid career for a medium that would collapse within a few years. But Charlie had a gambler's eye and a survivor's instinct, both sharpened by a lifetime of hard calculation. He weighed the risk against the reward, considered the money on offer and the strange possibilities of this new medium, and made his decision. He would take the leap. It was a bet on himself and on the future, exactly the kind of bold, self-believing wager that had carried him this far. And so, with characteristic nerve, Charlie Chaplin turned his back on the stage and stepped toward the cameras into a chaotic comedy factory that was about to give him the fright and the opportunity of his life. Charlie signed with Keystone Studios, the comedy factory run by the boisterous Mack Sennett, famous for its frantic chase scenes, custard pie fights, and bumbling Keystone cops. Suddenly, the young man who had polished every gesture on the stage was thrown into an assembly line of comedy churned out at breakneck speed. The pay was far better than anything the music hall had offered, a genuine leap up in the world, but the style could not have been more different from his own. Keystone comedy was loud, fast, and gloriously stupid, built on collisions rather than character. Charlie arrived full of ideas about subtlety and pathos, and the studio arrived full of pies. The clash was inevitable, and the sparks it threw off would light up the whole of film history. Keystone Studios was, in its way, a marvel of the young film industry, a relentless production line that pumped out short comedies at a pace that would make a modern content creator weep. Mack Sennett, its ebullient boss, had essentially industrialized slapstick, developing a house style of chaotic, high-energy mayhem that audiences absolutely adored. His films were built on speed and spectacle, on people running, crashing, tumbling, and hurling things at one another in a glorious, escalating frenzy. The famous Keystone Cops, a squad of hopelessly incompetent policemen forever careening about in undercranked cars, were the perfect distillation of the whole philosophy. Subtlety was not on the menu. Volume was. For Charlie, the financial improvement was immediate and dramatic. The salary Keystone offered dwarfed what he had earned grinding through the vaudeville circuit, representing a genuine and enormous step up in his fortunes. For a young man who had known real hunger, who guarded every coin with the wariness of someone who remembered the workhouse, this was no small thing. Money meant security, and security was something Charlie had craved his entire life. On that front, at least, the gamble was already paying off handsomely. But the creative reality was a rude shock. Charlie had spent years developing a comic style rooted in nuance, in character, in the careful marriage of laughter and emotion. He believed in the power of the small gesture, the meaningful pause, the flicker of genuine humanity beneath the comedy. Keystone believed in none of these things, Keystone believed in getting the film shot fast, packing in as many gags as possible, and moving on to the next one. It was comedy as a fire hose, blasting the audience with sheer quantity, and it left little room for the delicate touches Charlie held dear. The pace of production was frankly bewildering. Films were conceived, shot, and completed with astonishing speed, often improvised on the spot with only the loosest of plans. There was little time for the meticulous crafting Charlie instinctively wanted to apply, little patience for an actor who wished to slow down and find the truth of a moment. The whole operation was geared toward output, toward feeding the insatiable appetite of the nation's theatres, and an artist with perfectionist tendencies was not obviously an asset in such an environment. So Charlie found himself in a strange and frustrating position, richer than he had ever been but creatively caged, surrounded by a style of comedy he considered crude and beneath his abilities. He was the sophisticated craftsman dropped into a pie factory, and the mismatch grated on him from the very start. Yet within this frustration lay the seed of everything that would follow, because a talent as fierce and self-assured as Charlie's was never going to meekly conform. He was going to push back, insist on his own vision, and in doing so transform not just his own career but the entire medium. But first, he had to survive a genuinely rocky beginning, one that had some at the studio quietly wondering whether hiring him had been a mistake at all. Charlie's first steps in front of a camera were not the triumphant fanfare you might expect. He found the whole process baffling and creatively suffocating, hemmed in by directors who wanted him to flail about wildly and mug for the lens like everyone else. His instinct for quiet human comedy, the pause, the small reaction, the flicker of dignity beneath the pratfall was completely at odds with the studio's crash and bash philosophy. He argued, he sulked, and he grew convinced he could direct himself far better than anyone was directing him. For a newcomer, this was an outrageous level of confidence. But Charlie had spent his entire life certain of one thing, that he understood how to make people feel something, and he was not about to let a pie in the face convince him otherwise. The transition from stage to screen was genuinely disorienting, and not only because of the clash of comic styles. Film acting was a wholly different discipline, with its own strange rules and unfamiliar demands. There was no live audience whose laughter told you instantly whether a joke had landed. There was only the cold, silent, unblinking eye of the camera, and a director shouting instructions and the peculiar experience of performing scenes out of order in fragments. For a performer who had thrived on the direct current of connection with a live crowd, this was an alien and unsettling way to work. Worse, the direction he received actively fought against his natural gifts. The Keystone approach favoured broad, frantic, exaggerated performance, everyone rushing about at maximum intensity, faces contorted, bodies flailing. Charlie's early efforts to work in his subtler register were often overridden by directors who wanted more speed, more energy, more chaos. He was in effect being told to suppress the very qualities that made him special, and to become just another interchangeable Keystone clown. To a young man who knew precisely how good he was, this was almost unbearable. His response was not to quietly conform, it was to argue. Charlie, for all his shyness off stage, possessed an iron core of self-belief when it came to his craft, and he was not shy about voicing his disagreements. He clashed with directors, questioned instructions, and made it abundantly clear that he thought he knew better. This did not endear him to everyone. A brash newcomer challenging the established way of doing things is rarely welcomed with open arms, and there was friction, resentment, and no small amount of doubt about whether this difficult Englishman was worth the trouble. Some at the studio reportedly began to wonder whether hiring Charlie had been an expensive mistake. His early films did not immediately set the world alight, and his prickly insistence on doing things his own way made him a demanding presence on a set built for smooth, rapid production. There was a real moment where his entire film career hung in a delicate balance, where he might have been dismissed as an overconfident stage actor who simply could not adapt to the new medium. Many a promising talent has been quietly discarded at exactly such a juncture. But Charlie's stubbornness, so irritating to his colleagues, was also his salvation. He absolutely refused to abandon his conviction that he understood comedy and human emotion better than the frantic house style allowed. He kept pushing to inject character, timing, and feeling into his work, kept lobbying to direct himself, kept insisting that there was a better way. That unshakable confidence bordering on arrogance was the engine that would soon drive him to greatness. All he needed was the right vehicle for his vision, a character through which all his ideas about comedy and pathos and dignity could finally come to life, and that character, one of the most beloved in all of history, was about to be born in the most casual and accidental way imaginable. Then, in 1914, came the single most important costume change in cinema history. Told to throw together a funny get-up, Charlie assembled an outfit from odds and ends borrowed off other actors: baggy trousers, a tight little coat, oversized battered shoes worn on the wrong feet, a bamboo cane, a bowler hat, and a small square smudge of a moustache. When he put it all on and shuffled into character, something almost supernatural happened. A whole person came to life. The little tramp was poor but proud, shabby but dignified, forever getting knocked down and forever tipping his hat and carrying on. He was every underdog who ever lived, and he was, in truth, a gently comic portrait of the hungry little boy Charlie himself had once been. The circumstances of the costume's creation were almost comically mundane given what would come of it. Charlie needed a comic look for a film, headed to the communal dressing room, and began improvising an ensemble from whatever bits and pieces were lying around. He later described wanting everything to be a contradiction, and the genius of the final result lies precisely in those contradictions. The trousers were absurdly baggy, so the coat had to be absurdly tight. The shoes were enormous, so the hat had to be small. The cane suggested a gentleman of leisure, while the rest of him screamed abject poverty. Every element was at war with every other element, and the total effect was pure visual comedy before the character even moved. But the true miracle happened the moment Charlie put the costume on and began to walk. He later said that as soon as he was dressed, the character simply appeared, fully formed, and he knew instantly exactly who this little man was. That distinctive waddling walk emerged, feet splayed, cane twirling, the whole figure carrying itself with an air of wounded dignity, utterly at odds with its shabby appearance. The costume was not merely clothes, it was a doorway, and through it stepped a complete human being with a personality, a history, and a soul. It is one of the most extraordinary acts of spontaneous creation in the history of any art form. What made the tramp immortal was that contradiction at his very heart, the tension between his circumstances and his spirit. He was poor, hungry, and perpetually down on his luck, forever being kicked around by a world that had no use for him. And yet he refused to be beaten. He maintained an unshakable sense of his own dignity, a gentlemanly courtliness, a stubborn optimism that no amount of misfortune could extinguish. Knocked flat he would rise, dust himself off, straighten his battered hat, twirl his cane, and stroll onward as though nothing had happened. He was defeat, and defiance rolled into one small shuffling figure. It is impossible not to see where this character came from, because it came from Charlie's own life, distilled and transfigured into art. The tramp was the workhouse boy who had refused to be crushed, the child of the slums who had held on to his sense of self through poverty, abandonment and humiliation. Every ounce of hardship Charlie had endured was poured into this figure, but transformed, alchemized from misery into something tender and funny and universal. In making the tramp, Charlie was in a very real sense making a loving comic portrait of himself, of the hungry little boy from Walworth who had somehow kept his spirit intact, and audiences all over the world understood him instantly and completely. They did not need to know his backstory. They saw the little fellow, saw his poverty and his pride and his refusal to surrender, and they recognized in him something profoundly familiar. He was every person who had ever struggled, ever been overlooked, ever been knocked down and gotten back up. He belonged to no country and needed no language. He was quite simply the human condition wearing a bowler hat. And the moment he began to appear on screens, the world was about to fall in love on a scale that had never before been possible. The tramp did not so much arrive as detonate. Audiences fell in love with the little fellow almost instantly, and Charlie, now writing and directing his own films, poured everything he had into refining him. Freed at last to work his own way, he slowed comedy down, letting emotion breathe between the laughs, mixing slapstick with heartbreak in a way nobody had ever quite managed on film before. Each new short was better than the last, and his fame spread with dizzying speed. Within a staggeringly short time, the ragged boy from Walworth was becoming a household name, not just in America, but everywhere films were shown. The world had discovered its first true movie star, and his name was Charlie Chaplin. The speed of his rise is genuinely difficult to comprehend even now. This was not the gradual building of a reputation over decades. This was an explosion, a near instantaneous conquest of the public imagination on a scale the world had simply never witnessed. Within months of the tramp's first appearances, Charlie went from being a promising newcomer to being a sensation, and then from a sensation to a phenomenon. Audiences did not merely enjoy his films, they adored them, demanded more, and returned again and again to watch the little man triumph over adversity. Crucially, Charlie soon won the creative control he had fought for so bitterly. As his popularity soared, he gained the power to write and direct his own pictures, to shape every element to his own exacting standards. Freed from the frantic Keystone assembly line, he could finally make the kind of comedy he had always believed in, and what he made was revolutionary. He slowed the pace, allowed scenes to breathe, and gave his character room to feel. Where other comedians raced from gag to gag, Charlie let moments linger, trusting the audience to sit with an emotion before he delivered the laugh. This willingness to mix comedy with genuine feeling was his great innovation, the thing that lifted his work above all the slapstick surrounding it. In Charlie's films, you might laugh helplessly at the tramp's misadventures one moment and find a lump in your throat the next, as the little man gazed wistfully at happiness just beyond his reach. Nobody had done this before, at least not with such mastery. Comedy had been comedy, and drama had been drama, but Charlie fused them, discovering that laughter cut deeper when it was laced with sorrow, and that sadness landed harder when it followed a laugh. His obsessive perfectionism, which had made him such a difficult presence at Keystone, now became his superpower. Free to work at his own pace, he laboured over every detail, reshooting scenes endlessly until each gesture, each beat, each expression was exactly right. He treated his short comedies with the seriousness of a sculptor, refusing to release anything less than his best. This meticulousness showed on the screen, and audiences, even if they could not articulate why, sensed that his films had a polish and depth that the competition lacked. Each new picture was better than the last, a steady, relentless refinement of his art. As his films spread across America and then around the globe, Charlie's fame reached heights that had no precedent in human history. Because film could be copied and shipped anywhere, and because the Tramp needed no translation, Charlie became known and beloved simultaneously across countries and continents in a way no performer ever could have before. He was the first genuine movie star, the prototype for a kind of global celebrity that the world was only just learning was possible. The scruffy boy who had scavenged for coins was now a name on the lips of millions. And astonishingly, this was only the beginning, because both his fame and his fortune were about to reach levels that bordered on the absurd. Here is where our rags to riches story turns almost cartoonish in its extremes. As Charlie's fame skyrocketed, studios began waving contracts at him with numbers that seemed to belong in a fairy tale. He jumped from studio to studio, each one paying him more outrageously than the last, until his annual earnings reached figures that made him one of the highest paid human beings on the entire planet. Remember, this was a man who as a child had scavenged for scraps and dreaded the workhouse. Now he was being handed sums of money so enormous they were reported in newspapers as news events. The boy who once picked coins off a stage floor was now negotiating fortunes, and he drove those bargains with the shrewd, hard-eyed caution of someone who had known exactly what it meant to have nothing. The financial trajectory of Charlie's early film career is almost dizzying to follow. He began at Keystone earning a salary that already felt like a fortune to him. Then a rival studio, recognizing his box office power, lured him away with a dramatically larger sum. Then another offered more still, and then another, each contract leapfrogging the last as studios competed frantically for the services of the most bankable star on Earth. In the space of just a few years, his income multiplied many times over, climbing to heights that had no equal in the entertainment world and few equals anywhere else. To grasp the sheer strangeness of this, you have to hold two images in your mind at once. On one hand, there is the workhouse child standing in a scratchy uniform, spooning up thin gruel, gnawed by a hunger that never quite went away. On the other, there is the young movie star being courted by studio bosses waving contracts worth sums that ordinary people could not earn in 100 lifetimes. The distance between those two images, travelled in the span of a single young life, is almost impossible to fully absorb. It was social mobility of a kind that simply did not happen, compressed into a handful of astonishing years. The newspapers of the day treated his contracts as genuine news, reporting the eye-watering figures with a mixture of awe and disbelief. That a comedian, a maker of cheap, flickering entertainment for the masses, should command such wealth struck many as scandalous or absurd. But the studios were not being foolish. Charlie's films drew colossal audiences, and a colossal audience meant colossal profits, so paying him a fortune was simply sound business. He had become an economic force unto himself, a one-man industry whose name on a marquee guaranteed packed houses. What is most telling, though, is how Charlie handled his sudden staggering wealth. He did not squander it, did not tumble into the reckless excess that has destroyed so many who came into money too fast. The memory of poverty and of his father's ruin had planted in him a deep and permanent caution. He guarded his earnings carefully, negotiated his contracts with a shrewd and unsentimental hardness, and made sure he was never again at the mercy of forces beyond his control. Behind the gentle, beloved Tramp was a razor-sharp businessman who never, ever forgot what it felt like to have nothing. This hard-headed care with money would serve him well throughout his life, funding his independence and his art for decades to come. But wealth was only one measure of his extraordinary rise, and arguably not even the most remarkable one, because alongside the fortune came something even harder to quantify, and even more unprecedented, a level of pure planetary fame that no human being had ever experienced before. The whole world, quite literally, was falling in love with Charlie Chaplin, and the scale of that adoration was about to become a phenomenon with a name all its own. It is genuinely difficult to overstate how famous Charlie Chaplin became. This was a level of celebrity the world had simply never witnessed before, because never before had one image been shown to so many millions of people at once. His little mustachioed silhouette appeared on toys, dolls, sheet music and comic strips. People held Chaplin look-alike contests. Newspapers coined the term Chaplinitis to describe the global mania for him. In an age with no television and no internet, he had become perhaps the single most recognizable human being alive, adored on every continent by people who could not even speak his language, because his comedy needed no words. The scruffy tramp had quietly conquered the world, and its creator was still a young man. Fame, before the age of film, had always had natural limits. A stage performer could only be seen by the number of people who fit into a theatre, night after night, one town at a time. A monarch or a general might be widely known by name, but their actual face and manner remained a mystery to most. Charlie shattered these limits entirely. Because his films could be printed onto countless reels and shipped to theatres everywhere, his exact image, his walk, his expressions, his little dance of misfortune could be witnessed by millions of people across the entire globe, all at more or less the same time. This was a genuinely new phenomenon in human history, and Charlie was its first great beneficiary. The commercial frenzy surrounding him was staggering. His image was plastered onto an endless array of merchandise, an early and enthusiastic explosion of celebrity branding. There were Chaplin dolls and toys, Chaplin comic strips, songs written about him, and his likeness used to sell all manner of products. The Tramp silhouette became one of the most recognizable images on Earth, instantly identifiable from the bowler hat, the cane, the splayed feet, and the little square moustache. He had become not just a man but a symbol, a logo, a piece of shared global culture. The mania reached wonderfully absurd heights. Chaplin look-alike contests sprang up, in which hopefuls donned the costume and competed to best imitate the great man's distinctive shuffle. There is a delicious and possibly apocryphal legend that Charlie himself once entered such a contest incognito and failed to win, or even to place, which if true is one of the finest jokes the universe has ever told. The very fact that such a story could circulate and be believed tells you everything about the scale of the phenomenon. Imitating Chaplin had become its own popular pastime. The newspapers, reaching for a word to describe the sheer intensity of the public's obsession, landed on Chaplinitis, framing the worldwide adoration almost as a kind of pleasant, contagious fever sweeping the population. And in a sense, it was. People could not get enough of him. They flocked to every new film, devoured every scrap of news about him, and embraced the Tramp as a beloved friend. It was hysteria, but the warm and joyful kind, a collective delight in a little man who made the whole aching world feel a bit lighter. What makes it all the more remarkable is that this planetary adoration was showered upon someone who was still, by any measure, a young man, and one who had begun life at the very bottom of society. The child who'd been processed through the workhouse like a case file was now, arguably, the most recognized and beloved human being alive on the planet. It is a reversal of fortune so complete it strains belief. And yet, for all his wealth and fame, Charlie remained fiercely protective of his independence, deeply distrustful of the studios that grew rich off his genius. He was about to make a move that would give the artist, rather than the businessman, control over their own destiny, a revolution in the very structure of the film industry itself. Charlie was rich, beloved, and world-famous, but he was also fiercely independent and deeply distrustful of the studios who profited from his genius. So in 1919, alongside 3 other giants of early film, he did something revolutionary. He helped found his own company, United Artists, so that the artists themselves, rather than the money men, would control their own work and their own profits. It was a bold, almost defiant move, a poor boy's instinct to never again be at anyone's mercy translated into a business empire. From now on, Charlie would answer to no one. He would write, direct, produce, star in, and even compose the music for his films entirely on his own terms, taking as long as he pleased to make each one perfect. Ownership for a man who had once owned nothing was everything. To understand why this mattered so enormously, you have to understand how the film business worked back then. The studios held nearly all the power. They controlled production, distribution, and the theatres themselves, and they treated even their biggest stars as valuable but ultimately disposable property, to be worked hard and paid according to whatever the studio bosses deemed appropriate. An actor, however famous, was fundamentally an employee, dependent on the goodwill and the accounting of the people who signed the checks. For someone with Charlie's deep-seated horror of being powerless, this arrangement was intolerable. So Charlie joined forces with 3 of the most powerful figures in all of cinema, 2 beloved acting superstars and one of the most respected directors of the age, to overturn the entire model. Together, these 4 titans formed a company owned and controlled by the creative artists themselves. The whole point was to cut out the studio middlemen and keep both creative control and financial rewards in the hands of the people actually making the films. The joke around Hollywood, muttered nervously by the established studio bosses, was that the lunatics had taken over the asylum. The bosses were not amused. They were threatened, and rightly so. For Charlie, the benefits were profound and personal. As part owner of the company that made and distributed his films, he now enjoyed a degree of independence almost unheard of for any artist in any medium. He was free to make exactly the films he wanted, in exactly the way he wanted, answerable to nobody's taste or schedule but his own. There would be no more studio executives demanding more pies and faster shooting. There would be only Charlie, his vision, and whatever time and money he judged necessary to realize it. And time, it turned out, was something he was willing to spend with almost reckless generosity. Freed from all external pressure, Charlie became famous, or perhaps notorious, for the sheer painstaking slowness of his working methods. He would agonize over films for months and even years, shooting scene after scene, reshooting relentlessly, discarding vast amounts of footage in his obsessive pursuit of perfection. Where a studio might crank out a film in weeks, Charlie might labour over a single feature for the better part of a decade. It was extravagant, indulgent, and completely his right, because he owned the whole operation. This total control became the foundation of his greatest work. He is now not merely an actor, but a complete filmmaker in the fullest sense, the writer, director, producer, and star, and in time even the composer of his film's musical scores. Every element flowed from a single guiding vision, his own, which is precisely why his films feel so unified and personal. The poor boy who had once owned nothing now owned his own art, entirely and without compromise, and with that freedom secured, he was ready to reach beyond mere comedy towards something deeper, drawing directly on the wounds of his own childhood to create his first true masterpiece. With total creative freedom, Charlie began making longer, richer films, and the first great masterpiece was one that reached straight back into his own painful past. The Kid, released in 1921, told the story of the tramp raising an abandoned orphan boy in the slums, a tale of poverty, love, and the terror of being separated from someone you cherish. It was funny, yes, but it was also achingly tender, and audiences found themselves laughing and crying in the same breath. Nobody had to tell Charlie what a workhouse felt like, or what it meant to lose your family to forces beyond your control. He had lived every frame of that story, and by pouring his real sorrow into his comedy, he created something that felt profoundly, universally human. The Kid represented a significant leap in ambition for Charlie. It was a feature-length film, far longer than the short comedies that had made his name, which meant he had room to develop a genuine story with real emotional weight, rather than simply stringing together gags. This was uncharted territory. There was no guarantee that audiences who came to laugh would accept a comedy that also asked them to feel deeply, to invest in the fate of characters, to shed a tear alongside their giggles. It was a gamble, but Charlie had never been afraid of those. The story centers on the tramp discovering an abandoned baby, and, after some very funny reluctance, taking the child in and raising him as his own in his shabby garret. The two form a devoted, ramshackle little family, scraping by through minor scams and mutual love. The comedy flows naturally from their poverty and their partnership, but so does the heart, and the film's emotional core is the fierce bond between the man and the boy. When the authorities attempt to take the child away, the scene of the tramp desperately fighting to keep him is so raw and genuine that it has moved audiences to tears for over a century. It requires no great insight to see why this particular story poured out of Charlie with such force. The film is soaked in the experiences of his own childhood, in the poverty of the slums, in the terror of official institutions that tore families apart, in the aching bond between a vulnerable child and the fragile figures trying to care for him. Charlie had been that child, processed by uncaring authorities, separated from those he loved, subjected to forces entirely beyond his control. He didn't have to imagine the emotions in the Kid. He simply had to remember them. This is what elevated the film so far above ordinary comedy, and indeed above ordinary drama. By channeling his own real, unhealed sorrow into the work, Charlie created something that resonated on a level far deeper than mere entertainment. Audiences could sense the authenticity beneath the laughs, the genuine feeling animating every frame. The result was a film that made people laugh helplessly and weep openly, often within the same scene. An emotional experience of a richness that the medium had rarely, if ever, achieved before. He had proven that a comedy could also be art, could also break your heart. The Kid was a triumph, cementing Charlie's reputation not merely as the funniest man alive, but as a genuine artist capable of profound emotional depth. It confirmed that his instinct, the one he had fought so hard for against the frantic Keystone machine, had been right all along. Comedy and pathos were not enemies but partners, and in their union lay something close to the truth of human life. With this masterpiece behind him, Charlie was entering the most creatively glorious period of his entire career, a golden age of silent filmmaking in which he would produce some of the greatest motion pictures the world has ever seen. Through the 1920s and into the 30s, Charlie produced a string of films now regarded as some of the finest ever made. In the gold rush, he turned starvation and desperation into unforgettable comedy, memorably boiling and eating his own shoe as if it were a fine meal, a joke born from a childhood that had known real hunger. In City Lights, he blended slapstick with a love story so gentle and so beautifully sad that even the toughest critics were moved to tears. He laboured over every detail obsessively, reshooting scenes hundreds of times until they were flawless. He was no longer just a clown. He was an artist at the peak of his powers, crafting silent films of such emotional depth that they made the very concept of dialogue seem almost unnecessary. The Gold Rush, released in 1925, remains one of his most beloved achievements, a comedy set against the brutal backdrop of the frozen North during a gold prospecting boom. The film wrings extraordinary laughter out of genuinely grim circumstances, chief among them the constant threat of starvation. In its most famous sequence, the tramp, driven to desperation by hunger, cooks and eats one of his own boots with all the delicate ceremony of a gourmet, twirling the shoelaces like spaghetti and savouring the nails like fine little bones. It is uproariously funny, and it is also, when you think about it, deeply poignant. A joke about hunger made by a man who had known the real thing intimately. City Lights, which followed in 1931, may be the purest distillation of everything Charlie had learned about marrying comedy and emotion. The film tells the story of the tramp falling in love with a blind flower girl who mistakes him for a wealthy man, and his tender, self-sacrificing efforts to help her. It is packed with brilliant comic set pieces, but it builds toward a final scene of such quiet emotional power that it is regularly cited among the most moving moments in all of cinema. When the girl, her sight restored through the tramp's secret generosity, finally recognizes her ragged benefactor, the film ends on a single close-up of Charlie's face that says more than any words ever could. Behind these masterpieces lay a work ethic bordering on the fanatical. Charlie's perfectionism, given free rein by his independence, drove him to reshoot scenes not dozens but sometimes hundreds of times, chasing an ideal that existed only in his own head until reality finally matched it. He would agonize over a single gesture, a single expression, a single beat of timing, discarding enormous quantities of footage in the process. It was an extravagantly expensive and time-consuming way to work, and it drove his collaborators to distraction, but the results on the screen justified every frustrating hour. What emerged from all this labour was work of a depth and sophistication that transcended the label of comedy entirely. Charlie had elevated slapstick into genuine art, creating films that operated simultaneously as hilarious entertainment and as profound meditations on love, poverty, loneliness, and dignity. Critics who might once have dismissed the movies as vulgar novelty were forced to acknowledge that here was a true artist, working at the very highest level, using a supposedly lowly medium to say something real about the human condition. He had dragged the whole art form upward through the sheer force of his genius. These films represent the summit of the silent era, a golden age of visual storytelling that Charlie did more than almost anyone to create. Through pantomime alone, Through the eloquence of the body and the face, he achieved emotional effects that dialogue could scarcely have improved upon. He had made silence sing. But even as he stood at this artistic peak, a technological revolution was thundering toward the film industry, one that threatened to sweep away the very silent art he had perfected. The world was about to start talking, and Charlie Chaplin, stubborn as ever, was about to make one of the boldest decisions of his entire career. Then came an earthquake that shattered the film industry: sound. When talking pictures arrived, silent film was declared dead almost overnight, and every performer scrambled to adapt or vanish. Every performer, that is, except Charlie Chaplin. Stubborn, principled, and convinced that his beloved Tramp belonged to a wordless world, he simply refused to make his character speak. It was an enormous risk that flew in the face of the entire industry, the kind of gamble that could have ended a lesser career instantly. But Charlie believed pantomime was a universal language, and dialogue would only shrink it. So while the rest of Hollywood chattered away, he kept right on making silent films years after everyone insisted it was commercial suicide, betting his fortune and his legacy on the power of a raised eyebrow. The arrival of synchronized sound in the late 1920s transformed the film industry with breathtaking speed and ruthlessness. Almost overnight, the silent film, that exquisite art form Charlie had helped perfect, was declared obsolete. Studios rushed to convert, audiences flocked to hear actors speak, and careers were made and destroyed in the scramble to adapt. Performers whose voices did not suit the new medium found themselves suddenly unemployable, their silent stardom worthless in a world that now demanded dialogue. It was a brutal, wholesale reinvention of the entire business, and resistance seemed like professional suicide. Charlie, however, had profound and well-reasoned objections to the change, at least as it applied to his own work. He believed, with total conviction, that the little Tramp was a creature of pantomime, a universal figure precisely because he did not speak. A silent tramp could be understood and loved by anyone anywhere on earth, regardless of what language they spoke, because his comedy lived entirely in movement and expression. Give him a voice, and you would instantly shrink his world, tying him to a single language and shattering the universality that was the very source of his magic. To Charlie, making the Tramp talk was not an upgrade. It was a betrayal of everything the character was. There was also a deeper artistic principle at stake. Charlie considered pantomime to be a purer, more eloquent form of expression than mere speech, capable of conveying emotion and meaning with a subtlety that words could only clumsily approximate. He had spent his life perfecting the art of saying everything without saying anything, and he genuinely believed that dialogue was a cruder tool. Why would he abandon the sophisticated visual poetry he had mastered for the blunt instrument of spoken words? To him, the coming of sound represented not progress, but a coarsening of the art. So he did the almost unthinkable. He simply refused to conform. While the entire rest of the industry converted to sound with frantic haste, Charlie continued making silent films, or very nearly silent films, for years afterward, defying the conventional wisdom that such things were commercially doomed. Both the Gold Rush and City Lights were made and released as essentially silent pictures well into the sound era, and both were enormous successes, vindicating his stubbornness spectacularly. Audiences, it turned out, would still flock to a silent Chaplin film even when everything else in the theatre was talking. It was a colossal gamble, one that risked his fortune, his relevance, and his legacy on the proposition that his own artistic judgment was superior to the momentum of an entire industry. That he pulled it off again and again is a testament both to his genius and to the singular devotion his audiences felt for him. He had bet everything on the enduring power of wordless expression, and he had won. But the world was changing, and no artist, however stubborn, can hold back the tide forever. Eventually Charlie would have to reckon with sound, and when he did, he would use his films not merely to entertain, but to say something urgent about the increasingly dangerous world around him. By 1936, Charlie turned his attention to the anxieties of the modern world, and the result was Modern Times, a film that still feels startlingly relevant today. In it, the tramp is a factory worker driven to breakdown by the relentless, dehumanizing pace of the assembly line, quite literally swallowed up by the gears of a monstrous machine in one of cinema's most iconic images. It was a comedy, but it carried a sharp message about industrialization, poverty, and the way ordinary people were being ground down in the pursuit of profit. Coming from a man who had clawed his way up from the very bottom, this sympathy for the struggling worker was heartfelt and real. It was also the last time the beloved little tramp would ever fully appear on screen. Modern Times arrived at a moment when the world had ample reason to feel anxious about the direction of things. The Great Depression had thrown millions out of work and into desperate poverty, while the accelerating march of industrialization was transforming labor into something increasingly mechanical and inhuman. Workers on assembly lines were reduced to living cogs, performing the same tiny repetitive motions over and over until they were exhausted or broken. Charlie, ever attuned to the plight of ordinary people, saw all of this clearly and set out to make a film about it, wrapping his social commentary in the irresistible package of comedy. The film's most unforgettable images have become icons of cinema. The tramp, working frantically to keep pace with a speeding assembly line, tightening bolts until his very muscles rebel and his mind begins to crack, is comedy of the highest order that is also a devastating portrait of dehumanization. And then there is the astonishing sequence in which he is literally pulled into the machinery itself, sliding helplessly through the giant cogs and gears of the monstrous apparatus, a human being physically consumed by the machine he serves. It is funny, surreal, and quietly horrifying all at once, a perfect fusion of laughter and meaning. Beneath the comedy ran a current of genuine anger and compassion. Charlie was using the film to protest, gently but unmistakably, against a world that treated working people as disposable instruments of profit, grinding them down in the name of efficiency and leaving them to fend for themselves when they broke. His sympathy was entirely with the little man crushed by these vast impersonal forces, which is hardly surprising given his own history. He had been that little man, or very nearly, and he had never forgotten the feeling of being at the bottom, powerless before institutions that saw him as a problem rather than a person. This willingness to lace his entertainment with social critique was becoming a defining feature of his mature work, and it would eventually contribute to his troubles. But in Modern Times, the message was woven so skillfully into the comedy that audiences embraced the film wholeheartedly, laughing at the tramp's misadventures while absorbing, perhaps half-consciously, its pointed observations about their own increasingly mechanized world. It was propaganda of the most artful kind, if it was propaganda at all, delivering its ideas through delight rather than lecture. Modern Times also marked a poignant milestone, for it was the last film in which the little tramp appeared in his full, beloved form. The character who had conquered the world, who had made Charlie the most famous man alive, who had carried within him all the pain and dignity of his creator's childhood, was taking his final bow. The world was changing, growing darker and more dangerous by the year, and the gentle, wordless little figure no longer quite fit the times. Charlie sensed this, and his next film would confront the gathering darkness head-on, in a way that required at last the very thing he had resisted for so long. The Tramp would fall silent forever, and Charlie Chaplin would finally speak. As the world darkened toward war and a certain mustachioed tyrant rose to power in Germany, Charlie noticed something chilling. That tyrant wore a mustache uncannily similar to the Tramp's own. So Charlie made the boldest film of his life. The Great Dictator, released in 1940, was his first true talking picture, and in it he played both a humble Jewish barber and a preposterous dictator clearly modelled on Adolf Hitler, savagely ridiculing fascism at a moment when much of the world was still nervously silent about it. It was funny, brave, and it ended with a heartfelt plea for peace and human decency spoken directly to the camera. The little clown from the London slums had used his global fame to stand up to one of the most dangerous men alive, and history would remember it. There was an eerie, almost cosmic coincidence at the heart of the film's origin. Adolf Hitler, the most dangerous man on earth, happened to sport a small square moustache almost identical to the one Charlie had worn as the little Tramp for a quarter of a century. The two men were even born within days of each other. This uncanny resemblance was widely noted, and it gave Charlie a peculiar and powerful idea. Who better to deflate the terrifying dictator than the beloved little clown who happened to share his face? It was an opportunity to turn the weapon of comedy against genuine evil, and Charlie seized it. Making the film was an act of considerable courage, and not merely artistic courage. When Charlie began work on The Great Dictator, much of the world was still officially at peace with Germany, and powerful voices urged caution, appeasement, and silence about the horrors mounting in Europe. To openly mock and condemn a sitting head of state, to portray him as a ridiculous, dangerous buffoon, was a genuinely provocative act that risked controversy, censorship, and worse. Charlie pressed ahead anyway, driven by a moral conviction that overrode any concern for his own comfort or box office. In the film, Charlie plays two roles: a gentle, persecuted Jewish barber who is a clear descendant of the Tramp, and Adenoid Hinkle, the preposterous dictator who is an unmistakable caricature of Hitler. He mercilessly lampoons the tyrant, reducing his menacing pomposity to absurd, balletic clowning, most famously in a scene where Hinkle dances with the giant inflatable globe, cradling his dreams of world domination like a child with a balloon. It is comedy as resistance, laughter deployed as a weapon against fear, and it stripped away some of the terror surrounding the dictator by exposing the ridiculous vanity beneath. The film also demanded that Charlie finally, fully embrace sound, for its power depended on words in a way pantomime never could, and the most powerful words came at the very end. The film closes not with a gag but with the humble barber, mistaken for the dictator, delivering a long, impassioned speech directly into the camera, pleading for peace, kindness, tolerance, and the brotherhood of all people. Charlie steps almost entirely out of character to speak, in his own voice, a heartfelt appeal to a world sliding toward catastrophe. It is earnest, urgent, and unlike anything else in his work. A moment where the comedian sets down his mask to speak plainly to humanity. The Great Dictator stands as one of the bravest films ever made, a case of an artist using every ounce of his fame and talent to confront real evil at exactly the moment when it mattered most. The scruffy boy from Woolworth, now perhaps the most recognised human being alive, had chosen to spend that recognition on something far greater than laughs. He had used it to take a stand. It remains one of his crowning achievements, and one of the finest examples of art rising to meet its historical moment. But the same moral seriousness and outspokenness that made the film so courageous were about to draw the attention of powerful enemies, and Charlie's charmed public life was about to curdle into something painful. For all his on-screen tenderness, Charlie's personal life was a source of endless scandal and heartbreak. He married several times, often to women dramatically younger than himself, and these relationships frequently ended in bitter, very public divorces that the newspapers devoured with glee. He was a complicated, demanding, and famously difficult husband, and his romantic choices attracted a level of gossip and moral outrage that shadowed his career. Not until his final marriage to Una, the young daughter of a celebrated playwright, did he finally find lasting stability and genuine happiness, going on to have a large family with her. But by then the storm clouds of public disapproval had gathered thick around him, and they were about to turn into something far more dangerous than mere gossip. The contrast between the gentle, lovable figure on the screen and the turbulent, often troubled man in private is one of the great tensions of Charlie's story. The tramp was innocent, kind, and endearing, but his creator was a complicated human being with a messy and frequently unhappy romantic history. Charlie's relationships were a recurring source of turmoil, marked by dramatic marriages to very young women, stormy conflicts, and a string of divorces conducted under the harsh glare of intense public scrutiny. The press covered every twist with relish, and the affairs of the world's most famous entertainer made for irresistible copy. A recurring and genuinely troubling pattern was his attraction to women far younger than himself, some of them barely more than teenagers when he married them. By the standards of any era, these relationships raised eyebrows, and they generated significant scandal and moral condemnation. The divorces that followed were often bitter and financially brutal, playing out as public spectacles that damaged his carefully cultivated image. For a figure so beloved, Charlie proved remarkably adept at generating the kind of headlines that chip away at public affection, and the accumulation of scandal slowly began to sour his standing. He was also, by many accounts, a difficult man to be married to. The same qualities that fueled his genius, the perfectionism, the intensity, the absolute conviction in his own judgment, the deep insecurities buried beneath the confidence, could make him demanding and exhausting as a husband. The wounds of his childhood, the abandonment and instability and loss, surely left their mark on his ability to sustain intimate relationships. Whatever the causes, his romantic life through much of his adulthood was a churning sea of passion and conflict rather than a settled harbour. Then, later in life, came the great exception. His marriage to Una, the young daughter of a distinguished playwright, finally brought him the stability and happiness that had eluded him for so long. Despite a very large age difference that once again drew comment, the marriage proved deep, loving, and enduring, lasting until the end of his life. Together they built a large and devoted family, and by all accounts Charlie found in these later years a domestic contentment he had never known before. The man who'd lost his own family so young at last created a warm and stable one of his own, a quiet and hard-won victory. But personal happiness could not shield him from the forces gathering against him in the wider world. His romantic scandals had already tarnished his image, providing ammunition to those inclined to dislike him, and his outspoken political views, his sympathy for the poor and the working class expressed so openly in films like Modern Times, were beginning to attract a far more sinister kind of attention. In the tense and suspicious atmosphere of the era, a wealthy, foreign-born entertainer with left-leaning sympathies and a scandalous private life made an inviting target. The gossip that had dogged him was about to be joined by something with real teeth, and the beloved Charlie Chaplin was about to find himself under investigation. In the 1940s, Charlie's fortunes began to sour. A messy and sensational paternity lawsuit dragged his private affairs through the courts, and even though blood tests indicated he was not the father, a jury ruled against him anyway, wrecking his once cheerful public image. At the same time, his outspoken political views and his sympathy for ordinary working people drew the intense suspicion of powerful figures who accused him of harbouring dangerous left-wing sympathies. The nation's top law enforcement was watching him closely, building a file, waiting. The man who had made the whole world adore him was slowly being recast in the public mind as something untrustworthy, even un-American, despite the fact that he had never actually surrendered his British citizenship in all his decades in the country. The paternity suit was a lurid and damaging affair that played out in exactly the sort of public spectacle the press loved and Charlie dreaded. A young woman claimed he had fathered her child, and the case dragged his private life through the courts in humiliating detail. In a genuinely bizarre twist that reveals much about the era, blood tests were introduced that scientifically indicated Charlie could not have been the father. And yet the jury, apparently swayed more by his tarnished reputation than by the evidence, ruled against him anyway and ordered him to provide support. It was a startling miscarriage of logic, and it dealt a heavy blow to his standing. Running parallel to this personal humiliation was a far more serious and systematic threat. Charlie's politics, always sympathetic to the poor and critical of unchecked greed, had never been a secret, and in the increasingly suspicious climate of the time, such views were viewed with mounting hostility. He was accused, in the vague and menacing language of the day, of harbouring dangerous radical sympathies, of being insufficiently loyal, of being a subversive influence. Powerful figures within the government took a keen and hostile interest in him, and a substantial investigative file on his activities and associations steadily grew thicker. The nation's foremost law enforcement agency and its famous director watched Charlie with particular suspicion, treating the beloved comedian as a potential threat to be monitored and, if possible, neutralized. There was a certain grim irony in this. The man who had made a film pleading for peace, tolerance, and human brotherhood, who had bravely mocked a genuine tyrant when others stayed silent, was now himself being treated as a dangerous element by his adopted homeland. His compassion, so evident in his art, was being reinterpreted as something sinister. His status as a foreigner made him especially vulnerable. Despite having lived and worked in the country for decades, having become its most famous resident and one of its greatest cultural exports, Charlie had never taken citizenship, remaining a British subject throughout. In the charged atmosphere of the time, this was seized upon as evidence of divided loyalty, of a man who had grown rich off the country while withholding his full allegiance. It gave his enemies a convenient handle by which to grip him, a way to frame him as an outsider who did not truly belong. Slowly, painfully, the public image that had made Charlie the most beloved man on earth was being dismantled. The scandals had made him seem sordid. The political suspicions had made him seem dangerous, and his foreign status had made him seem alien. The warm affection of millions was curdling in some quarters into distrust and hostility, fanned by a hostile press and powerful officials with an interest in his downfall. The little tramp, that universal symbol of the underdog, was being slowly separated from his creator in the public mind, and Charlie was becoming, to his enemies, not a beloved clown, but a problem to be solved. The final, devastating blow was now only a sea voyage away. The final blow came in 1952. Charlie set sail for London to attend the premiere of one of his films, A Nostalgic Journey Home. While he was crossing the Atlantic, safely out at sea and unable to argue, the American government revoked his permit to re-enter the country, effectively exiling the most famous entertainer in the world from the nation that had made him a legend. It was a stunning, humiliating rejection. Rather than fight it, the proud old showman chose not to return, and instead settled with Una and their children in the quiet beauty of Switzerland, in a grand house overlooking a lake. The scruffy boy who had once dreamed of America now watched it recede behind him, gently and permanently, like the end of one of his own sad, silent films. The journey had begun innocently enough, even joyfully. Charlie was travelling to London for the premiere of a new film, a return to the city of his birth, the scene of all his early hardship and his first hard-won triumphs. For a man who had risen from the London slums to conquer the world, it was a sentimental homecoming, a chance to revisit the streets where it had all begun. He boarded the ship with his family, unaware that the country he was leaving behind had decided he would not be coming back. The blow was delivered with a cold, almost cowardly timing. Only after Charlie was at sea, safely out on the Atlantic and in no position to mount any immediate defence, did the American government announce that his permit to re-enter the country had been revoked. To return, he would have to submit to an inquiry into his politics and his moral character, a humiliating gauntlet clearly designed to punish and shame him. The message was unmistakable. The most famous entertainer in the history of the world, the man who'd done more than almost anyone to build the American film industry, was no longer welcome in America. It is difficult to overstate the cruelty and the irony of this moment. Charlie had arrived as a young unknown, and had given the country decades of unparalleled artistry, had made it the centre of the film universe, had brought joy to countless millions. In return, he was being cast out, barred from the land that had made him a legend, exiled through political manoeuvring and suspicion rather than any proven wrongdoing. The nation that had once been synonymous with limitless possibility, that had thrilled the young performer with its promise that destiny was up for grabs, had slammed its door in his face. Faced with this rejection, Charlie made a decision that reflected the fierce pride and independence that had always defined him. He would not come crawling back to beg for readmission, would not submit himself to a humiliating inquisition designed to break him. If America did not want him, then he did not want America. Rather than fight a battle he found beneath his dignity, he chose to turn his back on the country entirely, gathering his family and looking toward Europe for a new and peaceful home. He settled with Una and their children in Switzerland, in a beautiful estate overlooking a serene lake, surrounded by mountains and quiet and the security of his devoted family. It was, in material terms, a life of enormous comfort and beauty, a far cry from the Walworth slums, but it was also an exile, a permanent separation from the country where he had achieved everything, and there was a deep sadness beneath the tranquility. The boy who had sailed toward America full of hope now lived out his days across an ocean from it, watching from a distance as the land that had adored and then rejected him carried on without him. It seemed for a time a melancholy ending to a magnificent story. But the story was not quite finished, and the world would eventually find a way to make amends. Charlie lived out his later years in peaceful Swiss exile, surrounded by family, but the story was not quite finished. As the decades passed and old bitterness faded, the world remembered how much it loved him. In 1972, he was invited back to America to receive an honorary Academy Award, and when he stepped onto that stage, the entire room rose to give him the longest standing ovation in the history of the ceremony, a tearful apology, and a thank you all at once. A few years later, he was knighted by the Queen of England, the pauper's child now bowing before royalty. He died peacefully on Christmas Day in 1977, and then, in a final twist so absurd he might have written it himself, grave robbers stole his body and held it for ransom before it was recovered and reburied in concrete. Even in death, Charlie Chaplin could not resist one last impossible, unforgettable performance. The years of exile were, in their quiet way, among the happiest of his life. Surrounded by Una and their large brood of children, living in beautiful tranquility, Charlie found a domestic peace that the turbulent decades of fame had never allowed. He continued to work, making a few more films and composing music, but mostly he savoured the family life he'd been denied as a child. The wounds of his upbringing, the abandonment and loss, were perhaps finally soothed by the warmth of the home he had built. He had spent his life chasing security, and at last, in a Swiss house by a lake, he had truly found it. Meanwhile, back in America, the passage of time worked its slow magic on the public memory. The paranoid suspicions of the era that had driven him out gradually came to be seen as the shameful overreactions they were. A new generation rediscovered his films and recognized them for the masterpieces they had always been. The old bitterness faded, replaced by a swelling appreciation for the sheer scale of his genius and a growing embarrassment at how he'd been treated. The country that had cast him out began quietly to wish him back, and so, in 1972, came the Great Reconciliation. Charlie was invited to return to America to receive an honorary Academy Award, celebrating his incomparable contribution to the art of film. It was a delicate, emotional occasion, a homecoming for a man who'd been so cruelly exiled 2 decades before. When the elderly Charlie appeared on the stage, the entire audience of Hollywood's greatest figures rose as one, and gave him a standing ovation that went on, the longest in the history of the awards. It was thunderous, tearful, and unmistakably an apology, an entire industry and nation trying at last to say sorry and thank you in the same breath. The frail old man, overwhelmed, accepted their love with visible emotion. More honours followed to crown his final years. In a moment of perfect symbolic beauty, he was knighted by the Queen of England, the destitute child of the Walworth slums, kneeling to be honoured by the sovereign of the land where he had once queued for pauper's bread. The workhouse boy had become a knight of the realm. He had travelled the entire span of the social ladder, from its lowest rung to a place of honour before royalty, a journey almost too improbable to believe had it not actually happened. Charlie Chaplin died peacefully in his sleep at his Swiss home on Christmas Day 1977, an old and celebrated man surrounded by the family he loved. But even death could not write him an entirely ordinary ending, because the universe, it seems, had one last piece of slapstick in store. A few months after his burial, thieves dug up his coffin and stole his body, attempting to extort a ransom from his family. The bizarre plot eventually failed, the culprits were caught, and Charlie's remains were recovered and reburied. this time encased in concrete to prevent any further indignities. It was a final twist so ridiculous, so darkly comic, that it might have been lifted straight from one of his own films, and perhaps that is the most fitting farewell of all. The little man who had turned every hardship into comedy, who had made the whole world laugh through its tears, could not resist one last absurd, unforgettable act, even from beyond the grave. So there it is. The entire impossible arc of a single human life, traced from a cold room in a South London slum, all the way to a knighthood and a standing ovation that would not end. Tonight we followed a delicate boy with dark curls through hunger and workhouses, watched him lose his mother to illness and his father to the bottle, and saw him scavenge for coins in the streets of an empire that had no place for him. We watched that same boy pick himself up, again and again, refusing to be crushed by a world that seemed determined to crush him. We saw him clatter across stages in wooden clogs, learn the secret grammar of comedy under Fred Karno, and sail across an ocean toward a country that would first make him a god, and then, decades later, quietly break his heart. We watched a costume assembled from borrowed odds and ends give birth to the most beloved figure in the history of film, a little tramp who was really just a loving portrait of the hungry child Charlie had once been. And we watched him rise to a fame so vast and so unprecedented that the world had to invent a new word just to describe it. There is something almost unbearably human in all of it, because beneath the bowler hat and the twirling cane, beneath the fortune and the adoration and the honours, there was always that frightened, hopeful boy, forever tipping his hat to a world that kept knocking him down. He took every ounce of his own suffering, the poverty, the loss, the loneliness, the rejection, and he transmuted it into laughter for millions who would never know his name meant anything more than joy. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your warm bed, in a home with heating and running water, and a locked door of your very own, maybe spare a quiet thought for the little boy from Walworth, the one who queued for pauper's bread and dreaded the workhouse, who somehow held on to his dignity and his hope through all of it, and who used them to make the whole aching world feel a little lighter. Because history can be cruel and unfair and absurd, but it is also proof that even the smallest, hungriest, most overlooked among us can rise and dust themselves off and carry on. Sleep well,